Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Vermillion, and I'm the president of the Blue Springs Chamber of Commerce, and I want to welcome you to this Zoom meeting today. On this call, there are members from over 26 different chambers of commerce and business associations in the Kansas City area. And since there are 26, I'm not going to read all the names, but I do want to thank all of those chambers and those associations for working together to schedule this presentation. Thanks to Tom Lesnick, president of Independence Chamber, for running the Zoom meeting. If you have questions, he's going to save some time at the end for those. You can put them in the chat as you think of them, or wait until the end, that would be fine. To help with the quality of today's call, Tom is going to put everybody on mute. Today's presentation is the economic impact of COVID-19, and we organized this throughout these chambers because we felt like it was very important that the business community throughout the Kansas City area be on the same page. All of us have been in quarantine and we're starting to enter that reopening phase. Some of us will be May 3rd or May 15th. But this situation is unlike anything I've ever seen in my life, and I think anything I could have even imagined. And I think we all know that if we're going to recover, we're going to have to work together. So presenting for us today is Dr. Kuehl. He's the Managing Director of Armada Corporate Intelligence. He's the Chief Economist for the National Association of Credit Management and the Economic Analyst for the Fabricators and Manufacturers Association, and serves as the Chief Economist for several state accounting societies and other manufacturing associations. Chris has a doctorate in political economics and advanced degrees in Soviet studies and Asian studies, and was a professor of international economics and finance for over 15 years prior to starting Armada. Chris, thank you so much for being here today. We're looking forward to the information that you have to share with us. So I'm going to turn this meeting over to you.
Very good. Thanks very much. Well, here we are in uncharted territory, but, then again, we seem to always be in uncharted territory. This has been described by many people as a black swan event, kind of a classic black swan event. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, this is a concept that the economists simply stole from the philosophers maybe 10, 20 years ago. And it refers to something that is unexpected but expected. So we are currently dealing with a viral outbreak. It is not the first time we have dealt with a viral outbreak. We have been dealing with these almost every year for the last 10, 15, 20 years. We have dealt with SARS, MERS, avian flu, swine flu. We've dealt with West Nile virus and Ebola and Marburg, and we've had, every year a different kind of seasonal flu, sometimes very serious, sometimes not so serious. So it's no big surprise that we'd be hit with another viral outbreak. What is unusual is manifests, and every year there's a different encumbered situation. In this particular case, we have a virus that is kind of sneaky, and we'll talk a little bit about how that has played out in economic and medical terms. We're also dealing with kind of an unusual juxtaposition of crises, because the only way that we could really feel we could deal with COVID-19 was to shut down the world economy. And we'll talk a little bit about why that was the case. It had a lot to do with the way that the virus is spread. We have seen declining consumption. We have seen declining investment. We know that we've seen a lot more government expenditure, and we'll talk about the implications for that a little later. We've also seen exports fall off, and that really has nothing to do with the demand for what the U.S. produces. It has everything to do with the fact that every other country has been suffering from the same issues that we have been, and they have no more to spend than we do. So we're looking at about a $4 trillion loss in GDP just because of our interruption in global trade. So what I started to talk about earlier was the uncomfortable trade-off, and this is the situation we rarely face. There's no automatically good solution, because anything that we do to deal with the medical issue is going to make the economic issue tougher. Anything we decide to do on the economic side is going to make the medical side tougher. The reason that we have had to pursue a containment policy when it comes to COVID-19 is that any of the other standard responses were not available. Normally, when you're hit by something like this, there is in place some kind of response. There's the ability to test for the disease. There's an ability to treat the disease. there's something that gives you options. In this case, since it was a new outbreak and it was a virus that we did not know would transfer from animals to humans and then from humans to humans, we didn't have testing procedures in place. We didn't really have treatment procedures in place. Still really don't. So the only option was to try to separate people from another so that it wouldn't spread. What has made COVID-19 dangerous is not really its fatality rate, because the fatality rate is relatively low. It is lower than SARS, it's lower than MERS, it's lower than avian flu, it's lower than swine flu, it's lower than Ebola, Marburg. I mean, most of the viral attacks we've had are there, but they don't spread as fast, and they're also easier to spot. Even the flu, I mean, you think about it, we've all had the flu. We all know what that feels like. You know you have the flu within a day of getting the flu. Even if the symptoms aren't really manifesting, you know immediately. I mean, it's just, you know all the symptoms and you know what's coming. The trouble with COVID-19 is it has a 2-week incubation period, and about 50% of the people who get COVID-19 are asymptomatic. They don't show any signs at all. They are never aware that they have it. They end up becoming like a modern typhoid Mary, and they go on spreading it to everybody else in the world without even knowing that they had it. So the only option left was containment. The trouble with containment is that's down the economy. So now we are facing that critical point where we're going to reopen the economy, knowing that the virus has still not been completely controlled. We're basically going to have to work out a trade-off. How much are we prepared to deal with the virus? How much are we prepared to deal with the declining economy? In economic terms, this is relatively simple. It's cost-benefit analysis, but most of us really don't like working with cost-benefit concepts. We don't really want to weigh out things like, well, how many deaths is okay? You know, how much of a recession can we tolerate? But those are the decisions that are being left to us right now, uncomfortable as they may be. So getting to some of the more germane points here, the University of Washington was one of the first to start doing surveys, mostly because you saw the arrival of COVID-19 in Seattle pretty early in this process. Most states now have been through the peak. Missouri and Kansas are both at that point. A little bit later in Kansas, perhaps, than in Missouri, but the peak has been reached. Most of the rest of the country will be reaching it this week and next, so that by the end of April, you have theoretically hit the worst of the outbreak. Now you can start looking forward to a decline, though it may not be relatively fast. We've seen both types of decline around the world thus far. Some have been very rapid, and you've started a really nice little bell curve really quick. Others have not been so speedy. The University of Washington also followed up with an assessment of when they thought that various states would come back to normal economic terms. This is a lot scientific because you're depending on the decisions of 50 state governors and other interested parties. And a good example of that is if you look at Georgia, according to this survey, they were not supposed to reopen until the part of June. They were going to be very late. And this was based on the fact that the virus was evident in Atlanta, that it was still spreading in major parts of Georgia, but it did not take into consideration that the governor was going to decide to, one way or the other, turn his state kind of into a guinea pig. We are either going to discover that it was premature and their rate of infection is going to skyrocket, or we're going to learn that it was justifiable and that the infection rate is not as high as we thought it would be, and that the economy begins to recover. In any case, we're going to be getting an opportunity to kind of watch as this spreads out to other states. These numbers are fairly accurate. As about a day or so ago, they change obviously all the time. We're dealing in the vicinity of 2.5 to 3 million cases worldwide, around 2,000 deaths worldwide. Around 800,000 or so people have recovered thus far. And perhaps one of the most interesting and important of the statistics is the notion that about 96% have been minor. Minor meaning there's no hospitalization involved. It does not mean that it's not the worst case of flu you've ever had in your life. It does not mean that it's not a health threat in other ways, but it means that you're not required to go to a hospital setting. And that goes back to the fact that half of the population that has been infected shows no signs and makes it very difficult to track. The U.S. has had over 50,000 deaths now, 144 per million. Spain is in much worse shape at around 500 now per million. Around 14,000 serious condition and so on. Tests per million, we're catching up. We're probably around 15,000 tests per million now. Germany's still ahead, around 3,000 or so. The country that has done the most testing, if you want to go to the place where the majority of the people seem to know if they do or don't have COVID-19, it would be Iceland. Iceland has tested 190,000 people per million. So they are the most tested country in the world. Moral of the story is, if you want to escape the virus, live on a volcanic island in the middle of the North Atlantic that has a population the size of Independence, Missouri. And you have to listen to Bjork, but that's, a small price to pay. We have seen about 25 million people thrown out of work, and this is the economic crisis that accompanies the medical crisis. But it's important to look at that number a little more depth, because of that 25 million, around 80 to 85% of them would be better qualified as on furlough. Not just a semantic difference. What happened for a lot of workers is that the companies that were laying them off were telling them, look, we don't have any choice. We've been shut down by mandate. We cannot stay open. We fully intend to come back to life as soon as we're allowed to. If this is May, if it's June, whatever it happens to be, the second we come back to work, so do you. And we want you hired right away. So I don't know what you do in the time that we can't hire you, but hang on, because we'll hire you back. Around 10 to 15% are still in that category of actually laid off, and that number is larger as companies fail or as business is so slow that when companies come back, they don't come back fully. A lot of it's going to depend on what the consumer decides to do once the opening starts, because May could end up being the most stressful month for business. A lot of business is very excited about coming back and being allowed to reopen, but they also start running much higher risks. Up till now, they've been able to shut down. They don't have to pay anyone. They're not buying any supplies. They're not bringing in inventory. They're just waiting, hunkering down. In May, they are allowed to open up. So they will start hiring, and they will start buying supplies, and they will start buying inventory, and they will start turning on their lights, and they will start using up all kinds of resources, which they will have to pay for. If they don't have customers during that period, they will be in real trouble real fast. So the key to getting out of this mess is going to be the attitude of the consumer. The consumer is going to have to be willing to regain their confidence in the economy, resume their old behaviors to one degree or another. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. So far, the trajectories are behaving the way we want them to. You have definitely seen the peak and then subsequent decline in some of the Asian countries as well as in Europe. Early on, we could not trust the data that was coming from China. China was quite obviously lying to the world really back in November and December of 2019, and it was mostly because the Wuhan area didn't want Beijing to know what was happening out in the hinterlands, and so they were lying to their own government. Then China kind of picked up the torch and began the same kind of observations. Today, the data that's coming out of China is reliable simply because China is now overrun with health authorities. I mean, everybody you can think of is there. The WHO is there, the CDC is there, the European Ministry of Health is there, the Japanese Ministry of Health is there, the Filipino Ministry of Health is there. Everybody is there because China is the epicenter, and they all want to know what's happening. So the data that's coming out now is being provided by global health authorities more than it is by China itself, and they have made Good observation. Wuhan now has nobody in the hospital with COVID-19. They had their last death like 3 weeks ago. So it's a good sign if everybody else is following that same pattern. And you can tell South Korea is. You've seen the beginning of a decline in the European countries as well. We are right now at peak, and we should start seeing our own bell curve develop here pretty quick. Again, this is kind of a reiteration of how this thing has evolved. Right now, the majority of cases are showing up in the U.S. because we're just now hitting peak. We will start to see that decline like everybody else has. There are various estimates of who's going to be affected most by the overall COVID-19 threat. Missouri and Kansas are kind of in the least exposed categories, and that's only because we have not been hit quite as hard as some other states in the country, and most importantly, we are not as dependent on the more vulnerable industries. The states that are going to take the longest to come back are those that are most dependent on tourism, on sort of the traveling consumer, international consumption, just kind of the stuff that drives Florida and Nevada. Las Vegas is a ghost town right now, and if Vegas is shut down, so is Nevada, and that's not something that we are dealing with to the same extent in our own communities. If you look at where the outbreaks are, it's very predictable. It is going to be concentrated in the urban areas. So St. Louis, Kansas City have the most, followed by the middle of the state. Much of the state has been relatively untouched. All those kind of light color. And one of the conversations around opening up has been, will areas that have not been exposed be opened up first? Will those areas be allowed to fully function while the rest of the state waits? It's a possibility, but one of the concerns is that once you have an area, people in the unopened area will go there and end up bringing some of the virus with them. In the economic assessment of Kansas City, and this is not news to any of you, this is kind of your bread and butter, it's the population corridor in the Kansas City area. It's a nice straight, looks like a storm front coming through from the weather department, but that is the part of the Kansas City area that's going to be most affected by economic decline and the outbreak of COVID-19, because that's where the people are. So the more rural the communities in Wyandotte County or Clay County or Jackson County, the less. That's because they're further away from the population centers. And that's a little bit of an advantage overall. I was on a call, I guess a week or so ago, with a lot of people who were from the East Coast. And they were challenging some of the stunts because they said, look, there's no way for us to avoid crowds here. I mean, the only way that we travel is by subway and bus, and we're on commuter trains, and how do you avoid people? And what are you doing out in Kansas City? And I said, well, we have a light rail. It goes about 10 miles and then turns around. I think we have a bus or two, maybe three. Mass transit in Kansas City is more than 3 people in your truck. I mean, we don't have those two concentrations, and that has made us a little less vulnerable to some of the outbreaks, because this is at its heart a contact virus. And kind of advantage, disadvantage, we have been learning more about it with every passing week, and I'm not going to pretend to be a doctor here by any stretch, but the kind of reports coming out are reasonably encouraging. We now know, for example, that it behaves a lot more like the flu than we thought it did. It is sensitive to sunlight. It is sensitive to heat and humidity, which means that it will be fine in the summer months the way the flu does. We know, for example, that it's not as viable a morphing virus as flu tends to be, and that's going to be helpful when we get to the issue of vaccines. Right now, we have to deal with a new vaccine every year for flu, which we're all aware of. We have to get a new thing, blah, blah, blah. That's because the flu virus morphs very quickly. According to the research that's been done so far, COVID-19 does not morph very quickly, and if a virus vaccine is developed, it could be a multi-year vaccine. It could be 3 years, maybe 5. When you look at the advances in vaccines, it depends on who you talk to. The statements coming from some in the U.S. are it's a year away, 2 years away. The Germans, on the other hand, think they have one that'll be ready in 3 or 4 months. They have gone through the mouse trials, and it's performed spectacularly. They're now in the middle of a human trial. They have 500 people that they're trialing on this now. The Germans are talking about having a vaccine ready by August. So we'll see. We don't know for sure. Setbacks happen, but that's the encouraging news on the vaccine front anyway. So back to economics. You don't see this very often. This is the Purchasing Managers Index, which usually looks like some kind of an EKG, and all of a sudden we have the absolutely rock straight line that goes plunges down to oblivion. The Purchasing Managers Index is a very reliable month-to-month assessment of what's happening in the economy because it's just recording what purchasing managers are and are not buying. So you have seen month-to-month variability depending on where the economy is. I mean, obviously back in 2015, we weren't doing as well as we were in 2017, 2018. This is an uncharacteristically rapid decline, but what would one expect when you shut down most of the economy? The numbers with the Purchasing Managers Index matter because anything over 50 is considered expansion, anything under 50 is considered contraction. We are thoroughly in contraction right now, but you compare our PMI with PMIs around the world, everyone looks bad right now except China. China has begun to show that recovery. They got their Purchasing Managers Index to hit 50.1, not exactly robust growth, but it's at least above 50. And if they are pushing in that direction, we may be next. Something to bear in mind that just may explain a little of the severity of this recession. Lots of economists were predicting that we were going to have a recession this year anyway, regardless of COVID-19. That was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. But this was predictions that were being made last year in 2019. And the assessment was around 45% of the economists surveyed thought we'd be hitting recession this year. Around 30% thought we were going to hit it in 2021. So you're talking about 70% of economists thought we were heading that direction anyway. And that kind of explains why this has been as severe as quickly as it has been. And you can tell by some of the stories. I mean, I was listening to a piece one time, and it was like JCPenney has been driven out of business by COVID-19, and one of the casualties. And I'm like, excuse me? Penny's has been on death list for 3 years. I mean, it has been on the verge of bankruptcy for the better part of a half decade. I work with credit managers, and I deal a lot with the groups that are handling like JCPenney's, and they're all looking at each other like, I'm not giving them credit. No, me either. If JCPenney's wants to buy from me, it's going to have to be cash on the barrelhead. I don't trust them. COVID-19 killed JCPenney's. Lots of other things did. The internet, perhaps, other stores, bad decisions, who knows. And a lot of businesses were in trouble even before this, and this just became the push to shove them over the edge. We are probably going to see some kind of an impact on the elections, but that's going to depend on where we are in November, because the reality of elections has rarely changed. At this point, and even a year or two prior to this, a good 60%, if not 70% of the voters had already made up their mind. You have a circumstance right now where 30% of the voters are going to vote for Trump no matter what. 30% of the voters are going to vote against Trump no matter what. They have made up their minds years ago. Nothing is going to change either one of them in any way, shape, or form. Now you are dependent on that 30 to 40% in the middle who have not yet made up their mind. We know motivates that group. It's been around forever. It's the economy, stupid. They are going to wait and see how they feel in the first week of November. And traditionally, population on election day, they vote for the incumbent. It's like, hey, I feel good. They must have gotten me here, so I'm fine. If they don't feel good on election day, they vote for the challenger regardless. It's like, I don't feel very good. It must be the incumbent's fault. I'm going to vote for somebody else. Right now, the election would probably turn against the incumbents because people are happy and they're unemployed and they're worried. Between now and November, what if we have a boom? People may feel a lot better by the time they hit third quarter. And if they do, it's going to affect how they vote. We have seen most companies experience in decline. Most are reporting that their decreases have been more than 10%, and that continues to accelerate because this was late March. We have seen the impact on the stock markets, but they have been kind of replaced by more erratic stock market behavior. We're back to that normal responding to one rumor or another. I mean, a good example of how weird the markets can be. Remember about a week ago, the oil markets bounced up for a day. I mean, the markets have been down and are back down again, but they went up for a day because Trump made a statement that if an Iranian warship attacked American warship, we would respond by destroying the Iranian warship. And for some reason, the oil market decided that that was something dramatic and new. That policy has been in place for about 235 years. It started in the Revolutionary War. If a opposing army attacks our army, we attack back. There's nothing new about this. Never has been. And furthermore, Iran right now has nothing to do with the world oil situation. But the markets were so desperate for anything to respond to that they decided that that was good news and spiked for about half a day until people began to think of it and say, well, what difference does that make? Nothing. And the markets fell again. If we look at consumer concerns, this is a bit of an eye chart because it's trying to cover all the world. A couple of things that are interesting. You've got around 70% of Americans that are fearful about the coronavirus outbreak, but only about half that are really changing their activity. So about 25% afraid but aren't going to do anything different than what they've done before. And that's fairly significant as we try to figure out how the consumer is going to react once we start opening things back up. We know it has become more popular. People are saving more. That's always good. People are buying a lot more food as they can't go out to eat like they used to. A lot more expenditure on healthcare and vitamins and supplements and things like that. But one of the things to get out of the chart is the importance of thinking through some of the statistics that are offered, because here you have in big, bold red a 21% decline in the purchase of outerwear, jackets, and coats, as if this was somehow connected to COVID-19. It is April. It is spring. People generally don't buy outerwear, jackets, and coats at the beginning of spring and summer because there's this thing called temperature, and it gets warmer. If there is a corresponding decline in outerwear purchasing come October, that might be something to worry about. But this is one of those things like you kind of look at this going, I don't really think that's the cause, just offhand. What are consumers responding to as far as how companies are presenting themselves? The most important thing to get out of this, I think, is brands that are trying to reassure customers that they are safe and are keeping their health interests at the forefront are catching a lot more consumer enthusiasm. It is tending to get consumers to recommend the brand, prefer the brand over another. So a lot of it is kind of reassuring the consumer that your company is on their side. Most people feel that they are knowledgeable about COVID-19, but their actions demonstrate an entirely different approach. There are a lot of people that are fearful, a lot of people who are doing various things that they think or hope will help, but even something as simple as wearing masks. When the German government decided that it would be a good idea for people to wear masks, everybody in Germany got this booklet on how to wear the mask and trying to explain what it was for, that It was not there to prevent you from getting the COVID-19 virus, because it doesn't work that way. It is there to prevent you from giving it to somebody else. So if you think you have the COVID-19, you wear a mask, because now if you sneeze off whatever, it's going to stay connected to you. What people are generally not aware of is that one of the most common ways to acquire the virus is through your eyes. It's the most exposed and moist part of your face. You can keep your hands away from your face to a degree, but all of them messing with their eyes all day long. And if you try to wear a mask that covers your eyes, you have other problems that will complicate your daily life. The fact is, we really don't know a lot about what to do to protect ourselves, which is why we've had these rather draconian steps that kind of like, we're just kind of at a loss as for what people should be actually doing to protect themselves. Something that's encouraging coming again out of China is that 92% of their consumers express confidence in battling the virus. This is significant because the Asian consumer in general has always been a more cautious consumer than us. We are the spending champions of the world. They tend to be more saving oriented, whether it's China or Japan or Korea. That's always been a characteristic of Asian consumers. If their confidence levels are this high, then we can expect ours to be similarly high once we begin to reopen. And that's going to be the critical thing, because right now polls indicate, and they're all over the place, none are really national, but they're all sort of agreeing on the same basic parameter. About 25% people who are asked are definitely ready to get back to normal. As soon as the all clear is sounded, they are going to be scheduling appointments and got to restaurants and just doing everything they can to go back to their old life. Around 25% have decided to become doomsday preppers and are not going to leave their basements for the next 6 years and are going to hide behind their 800 rolls of toilet paper and just wait it out. So it all comes down to that 50% in the middle that hasn't really decided what they're going to do. They are waiting for some kind of a definitive statement. What really is happening? What really can I expect? What steps are these companies taking to protect me? What can I do to protect myself? That's going to be the key. If those people come out in sufficient numbers, then business will recover. If they don't, then business is going to struggle because they're going to have plenty of expenses and not a lot of revenue. We have seen some impact on shopping. Shopping for groceries online. Most people are doing a little more of it, but it hasn't increased dramatically. You have seen a fairly substantial percentage of people who had not tried it before, but most of the people who were getting deliveries were getting deliveries before. You have not seen an increase in shopping for electronics. You've not seen an increase for shopping on clothing. You haven't even really seen an increase in food or takeout food. So much of our behavior is still fairly similar to what it was before. We have made some adjustments, but not to the point that we've completely changed our habits. Which jobs are vulnerable? They have tended to be lower paid jobs. The last recession, 2008, that was more of a upper wage income recession because it was a banking sector recession. We saw the collapse of Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns and Merrill Lynch and Washington Mutual and on and on and on. It cost the financial sector a lot of employment. This one has been hitting the sector hard. It's been hitting sectors that are dependent on tourism, dependent on consumers, and those tend to be lower paid jobs, which means that the people who lost their jobs got in trouble a lot faster. If you're a high income person and lose your job, the presumption is you've got some savings to work off of. For a lot of people that lost their jobs this time, they were week to week and day to day, and they did not have the ability to come bouncing back. One of the big concerns a lot for business is that when people start opening up and coming back to work, will their workers come back to work? There will be a certain percentage that will look at what they're getting from the government right now and say, look, I make more money with the unemployment check than I'm getting and the extra $600. I'm not going to go back to work. I'm going to make more money staying off the rolls. That is a category of worker that we've always referred to as the transactional worker. They are the ones who do not think of their job as anything approaching a career. It is just a job. It is just a paycheck. These are the people that have for years left your employee to go work for somebody else for 25 cents more a month. I mean, they don't have loyalty because that's not the name of the game. They just want to get paid. The 80% that are not transactional workers will return because they're looking at their job as, if I stick with this company, I might get a percent, I might get a raise, I might get more benefits, I might get training, I might get something for being with this company. They will come back with not much hesitation. The transactional worker, frankly, has always been hard to hang on to because they respond to just one thing, and that is, what am I being paid? And if somebody is paying me slightly more than you are, I'm out of here. We have seen a lot of new orders and sales reactions. Most companies are in that decline between 15 and 50%. A few have not seen a lot of impact, but the majority are in that fairly significant range. We have seen a decline in airlines, and this is an example of where rules can be problematic. The airlines are losing money because they're still required to fly. If you want to hang on to your route, you have to keep maintaining that route, even though there's nobody on the plane. So the airlines are hemorrhaging money, which is why they're going to be getting about a $30 billion bailout from the government. The government will, in turn, get equity in most of those airlines. This will be sort of like we had with GM a few years ago when GM got a bailout and the government got equity in GM with the presumption that when GM recovered, those stocks would be worth more, would then sell its equity stake, make back some of the money that it contributed to the bailout. That's the general idea for the airlines, is that they will recover and the government will sell off its equity stake. Because states that have more dependence on retail and leisure and hospitality have been the most severely affected. Obviously Nevada because of Vegas, obviously Florida. Who knew that Montana was as dependent as it is on retail, leisure, and hospitality? We have seen a sharp decline in tourism, but it is one that is probably likely to recover relatively quickly if we do get a May rebound, because this is vacation season. It is the travel season. And any of the other inhibitions to travel that may have existed in previous years won't be around this year. I mean, if you were planning a driving trip, gas is $1.40 in some jurisdictions. I think you can take a driving trip in your MV this year. We have seen a surge in remote work. We'll have to see how long that lasts. Early on, people were wildly enthusiastic about it. But 2 or 3 weeks in, people were like, you know, I really hate that. I'm tired of being at home. I am tired of dealing with pets and kids and all the other things that happen at home. I miss my work friends. I want to go get a Starbucks coffee again. So we'll see. I think you'll probably see more balancing where there will be some people that work from home part of the time and stay in their office environment the other part of the time. So we're going to kind of end up a little bit of an optimistic end here. These are the projected outcomes for the economy. The majority of economists are still predicting a May reboot, that we get most of our businesses back in May. That happens, we are back to fairly normal growth by the end of the year. We are getting into a pattern where we may have lost over the course of all of 2020, maybe even a half points, which is recoverable. Then by 2021, we actually find ourselves in a boom. There is also the possibility of a summertime recovery, which puts us till June or July. That might also set up a fall resurgence. We don't know what that would do to the economy. It would depend on whether the decision was made to shut things down again. I think that would be really, really unusual. Know how much damage the first shutdown did. I don't think anyone's going to want to go for a second shutdown. We would just have to figure out a way to live with the resurgence. If you ask most economists, kind of in a poll taken by Reuters long ago, most of them are predicting a U-shaped recession. which is one that goes down in a hurry, which it did in March, kind of lingers at the bottom, April, and begins to come back in May. So you get a U, not quite a V. The V gets a sharper rebound, but somewhere in that range. If you look at some of the big financial institutions who really have to put money where their mouth is, they are expecting that first quarter numbers will be cruddy. They expect second quarter numbers to be even worse. But by third quarter, we're looking for pretty substantial recovery and stuff that extends into fourth quarter. Only Wells Fargo is kind of holding out for still a weak third quarter, but even they're on for a better fourth quarter. And most of them are predicting a really strong 2021, that barring some kind of reemergence of another misvirus, that we would see a pretty substantial recovery, both in terms of consumer behavior and business behavior. Even if you ask most just ordinary people, a whopping 56% think we're going to get that U recovery, that we'll see things becoming much better in May. Around 20% think it's going to happen early May, and that we're going to see a nice little V. Not that many people are predicting the dreaded L, or checkmark recovery, which is what we got in 2008. Seriously, right now, the 2008 recession is still the worst recession, worse than this one, because that was a traditional recession which took its time in recovering. This one is, like I said, imposed. It's a lockdown recession. It was not triggered by a weakness in the economy. Getting out of this is a matter of lifting the restrictions and people resuming habits. Getting out of the 2008-2009 recession meant completely reorganizing the banking sector. It meant fixing the financial world. It meant dealing with a collapse of global credit, which took months, if not years. We had so many permutations of that recession that drug out all the way up till 2016, 2017. So I leave you with this. After a month or so of working at home and doing webinars, I'm beginning to look more like the guy on the left than I would care to. And then we have the great toilet paper adventure of 2020. I understand hoarding, I really do. I understand that it is a very natural response to shortages and uncertainty. And I had my share of hoarding when this first came out. I ran out to my local wine store and bought 2 cases of wine. Finding a substitute for a good Cabernet is not easy. Finding a substitute for toilet paper, yeah, it's doable. I saw on YouTube that you can now do a DIY project and make your own home bidet with a garden hose and duct tape. So, there may be people out there that are willing to try this. I would not be one of them. So, we're going to take questions now. And if there are any that you have in mind, or if we run out of time for questions, feel free to send them to me by email. I am just as long-winded in print as I am in public. So, I'll find my little chat box here.
So if anybody has questions, please put them in the chat. I don't see any right now, but perhaps they're holding on to them.
They could be. So either that or they've all run out because they just heard that Walmart got a shipment of toilet paper. One does, speaking of that, it's kind of a ridiculous topic, but speaking of the toilet paper mess, what we've also learned is how bizarre our supply chains are. Part of the reason, honestly, that we've had a shortage of toilet paper is that 40% of the toilet paper manufactured in the country is institutional. It's the stuff that goes to airports and stadiums, and we all know those giant rolls, and they're not set up to provide the home market. And suddenly, nobody was using institutional supplies. They were all using home supplies, and those companies could not convert making the toilet paper for home use. So it's just one of the things where we had a very efficient supply chain where things were made specifically for a purpose, and then all of a sudden we didn't need that purpose. And here we sit with institutional rolls of toilet paper that nobody can use.
Chris, it looks like you have a question about the unemployment rate.
Yes. Here we go. to my chat meeting. All right. If there's a method of determining the percentage of furloughs against life, it's it's tricky because people are not necessarily reporting them as one or the other. The majority of the larger companies have indicated to their employees that they're treating it like a furlough, that they intend to hire them back as soon as they're able to, but they're not necessarily making a pledge. Like the hotels are all basically saying, look, as soon as we're open, we're going to hire everybody back, we think. It depends a little on whether we get occupancy. We'll probably bring back a skeleton crew at first, and then as people start to show that they're willing to come into the hotels, we'll hire the rest of you. So it is somewhat dependent, again, on consumer demand. Some stores, some operations will hire everybody back immediately because they have to. They can't function without them. What do you think the consumer response in the U.S. will be as strong as, I didn't quite catch the rest of that. Here we go. As in other places in the world, especially when a greater percentage of people here lost their jobs or had their hours reduced. Actually, we've not had a bigger percentage. Other countries have had pretty much the same experience with job losses as we have had. It is pretty much a universal experience. Our consumers have tended to be historically more aggressive and more determined about consumption. We are far and away bigger consumers than most of the Asian countries. We're quite a bit more active than the Europeans. So if we stick to form, we're more likely to be out purchasing and buying and that than other countries. It depends on how confident we are. Part of it is also whether or not people are happy or contented with their leadership. The Germans, for example, are a lot more confident in the messages they're getting from their government. And when people have asked, they said, why are you that way? And they said, well, look, our chancellor was a scientist for 25 years before she became the leader of Germany. We sure. But if you go to India, if you go to Italy, if you go to the UK, if you go to the US, there's a lot of, well, we don't know what to believe. You know, one guy says this and the other guy says that, and you know, we don't know what to believe. You know, the Germans are being Germans. It's like we take orders, and we trust our chancellor, and that's what she told us to do. Okay. Another question. We're out of the stock market and considering getting back in. No, there isn't a crystal ball. Well, I always have to warn people when an economist is giving you investment advice. How many of us are really rich? Not many. The real issue with the market is, I guess, watching people who exploit moments like this. The contrarians are buying like crazy. Warren Buffett and his ilk are basically saying, look, these will all come back. You know, you're thinking the airlines are going to, you know, go out of business. People were never going to fly again. Try again. So the contrarians are buying heavily, and that's one of the reasons the market keeps bouncing up, is that people are snatching up those grants. Another question, I'm concerned about the local governments and their loss of sales tax, et cetera. That is going to be a really huge issue. The states and the cities are not in a position to be able to recover. That money is lost forever. It is not like they can increase taxes for the rest of the year to make up for what they lost. There's going to be some very uncomfortable decisions that have to be made. There are going to be cuts, there are going to be reductions of services, and there's have to be more attention paid to new revenue sources. That may be the most serious lingering problem, because it was a problem before. States were worried about what was going to happen with sales tax because of the internet sales. That's now become amplified. So stay tuned, because that's going to be a really tough nut to crack for everybody. Another question, what one or two financial moves do you recommend families make based on expecting the economy to boom back in 2021? Really, it's just, you know, be reasonably frugal, but just kind of take advantage of opportunities as they present themselves. Recessions have always had this sort of Jekyll Hyde orientation. On the one hand, if you are caught up in it and you've lost your job, I mean, it's just absolutely miserable. But there's a percentage of us that survive it and suddenly look around and say, oh God, everything is cheap, everything is on sale. And so maybe now is a good time to make some of these purchases, acquisitions. So it becomes kind of a matter of looking at your own circumstances and paying attention to where you personally have ended up. Because, for example, companies that are in the medical business right now are making a lot of money. The demand is absolutely huge. So they're in a position now to look at everything from equipment acquisition to even mergers and acquisitions with others. Has the continued closure of schools in May and June affect the recovery curve? Not really a whole lot, simply because this is the time of year that the schools shut down to a degree anyway. It's the summer months. This is kind of the slow period for school. The key for the schools will be, will they be able to come back in August? And if there's a full recovery or if there's partial recoveries, most schools now are still talking about a 100% recovery by August, and part of it's driven by societal needs. Working parents have to have their kids in school. I mean, it's kind of like, this is great if I'm working at home, but if I'm called back to work and my kids are still home, now what do I do? So the expectation is that education will go back to normal, but probably with pretty significant protocol changes. Effects of the recent oil dispute, potential recovery. The dispute part is kind of over. Russia and Saudi Arabia have also now reduced their production, and they're sort of in the same boat everybody else is. The issue with oil now is demand. There just is no demand, and oil is being stored at a prodigious rate. That doesn't end until the demand returns, and that's something perhaps that we'll see in May, early June. A response to the opinion, our government is going to do everything it can to keep the economy moving through the election, but after that, all bets are off. I don't know that the government really at this point has the power to do much more than it's now doing. The activity has all sort of been based on getting the consumer engaged. So everything the Fed has done has been to try to get money into the banks so the banks get it into the business community. The $2 trillion, now $3 trillion has been to help preserve jobs, try to put money in people's pockets. None does anything until the consumer begins to start spending. That will probably happen in May and June, and it will certainly be the most closely watched activity. If the consumer responds, then we're in pretty good shape going into the latter part of the summer and early fall. There are certainly those that would try to play the economic game all the way to the bitter end, but at this point, it's been under such kind of out of control of the government that it's hard to really manipulate it. It's a global problem, and it's going to be one that responds to decisions made all over the place, not just here. How long is the extra $600 supposed to continue? It's supposed to end in July, from what I understand. Inflation, because of the stimulus package, probably not manifesting until maybe later in the summer, but it also depends on how much of that money is basically used to offset the losses in March and April, in which case it would not be inflationary. The real issue is what the Fed does with all the bonds that they are being forced to buy. Most of the bonds that are being issued to finance the stimulus are being purchased by the Fed, just like they did back in 2008. And now they're back with some enormous balance sheet that they're going to have to figure out a way to pay down in the years to come. How's the government going to pay for the money? Well, that's easy. They're going to take from the taxpayer or borrow it. Right now, they're borrowing it. They are selling bonds, which are mostly being bought by the Fed and by a few other institutions. And it's kind of how we have always financed. With regards to those who are choosing to stay on unemployment, not going back to work, will they be allowed to stay? Temporarily. I mean, the unemployment extension goes to about midsummer and then begins to fade. Some of them will, it depends a little on their state circumstances. And as I said, the ones that are most likely to stay on unemployment are the transactional workers, who are a minority, thank goodness, of the majority of the workforce. And it will be kind of up to businesses to figure out how to separate their transactionals from the non-transactional. You know, people who have some sense that there's a reason to stay with the company are the ones who don't decide to go back on unemployment. There's a lot of jobs where it's just the nature of the job. It isn't that kind of future promotion-oriented job. Will colleges go back to session? Yes, indeed, they will. They have to. That's where their money comes from. And the insights on what's happening in Russia. Putin was denying that there was any issue for quite a while, and he was actually counted as one of the ostrich alliance. There are several countries where the leaders are saying, there's no COVID here. Nope, everyone is fine. And then they had to explain why 30,000 people had died. That is right now including Nicaragua, Turkmenistan, Belarus, and Brazil, of all places, and Russia used in that category as well. So, well, at the risk of leaving questions unanswered, I get to jump off onto another webinar now. And so if your question did not get answered, please send me an email or call me, and we will continue this conversation. So thanks very much for all your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on this webinar today. We appreciate your perspective. For those of you listening, thanks for attending. We will be sending a link of this presentation, because it has been recorded, to all of the chambers. So have a great day, everyone.